All right, yeah, we're ready to get going. So this is our third and our final event in our Spring Wild Ideas speaker series. And last week we heard from Tracy Bowerman and got to reap the benefits of her incredible knowledge and research of salmon. And the week before, we met many of the local salamanders with Torsten Watkins. And if you weren't able to join us for either of those, you can actually find them on our YouTube. And this one will also be uploaded to our YouTube later. Um, so just, I did get a question in the chat, and we are going to keep everybody on mute tonight, except for me and the speaker, until the very, very end, like maybe after, just to reduce the chaos. So yeah, that's what we're going to do right now. But so I know Wild Ideas is coming to an end, but I want to let you know about other land trust events that are coming up. As you all probably know, March is the hardest time of year for our migratory mule deer, many of whom are pregnant. They're making their way up valley in our foothills, and we so appreciate everyone respecting the closures in the Sage Hills and Horse Lake trails. We do hope to see you out enjoying the early flowers starting next Thursday, April 1st, which is opening day. So you might even see some land trust employees and volunteers out welcoming folks at trailheads that weekend. So come say hi. On April 6th, Munchin House in Leavenworth is generously donating 25% of their profits to the land trust. So stop by if you're in the mood for a brat and say hi. I will probably be there between 12 and 2, although the event goes all day, but I would love to see some of you out there. So even though every day is Earth Day here at the Land Trust, on Saturday, April 17th, we're going to be at the Outdoor Earth Day Fair at Pybus, which is put on by Sustainable Wenatchee. So come say hi then as well between 10 and 2 on April 17th and celebrate the Earth with us. And then finally, there are a few volunteer opportunities starting to show up here and there. You can find more information about those at our website, cdlandtrust.org, and fill out our volunteer interest form if you haven't already to be notified about new events. Okay, so now just a few technical details before we get started. Like I mentioned, we are going to keep people on mute just to reduce the chaos. And probably the best view option for this event is speaker view, which is usually found in the upper right-hand corner. Also, Kathy's going to be putting some resources in the chat, and I think she already has been. And the chat can be found in the lower bar. And if you ever have any questions for the speaker, you can put those in the chat as well. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we will make sure that the questions get asked at the end. And you can ask them publicly or privately, just to me, if you'd rather do that. And also, you'll probably want to turn off your camera when the presentation starts just to keep distractions to a minimum. But for right now, I would love to see everybody's faces because I want to thank our members. We've been doing this at each Wild Ideas, and I just love it. So if you're a member and you're in a place where you can have your camera on, will you turn it on and wave at your camera for a few seconds so that we can thank you? Yay! Welcome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ooh, there's 2 screens now. Yay. Thank you all so much. You all know this, but it's only because of you that the Land Trust is here today and can do the work that we do. Thank you so much for your support and your willingness to help care for local places where we can all get out and spend time among wildflowers and wildlife, and the places that you're taking care of. They also provide homes for that wildlife and the native plants, and they clean our air and our water, and they provide hope that future generations will grow up to love this place as much as we all do. So thank you all so much for your support. And if you are not a member, I think you know what I'm going to say. Please join us. You'll be helping care for the land and the water and the trails that we all depend on. And we have events like these, as well as hikes and outings when it's safe to gather. And there's always ways to get involved through volunteering, and our members are the first to hear about conservation news and new projects in our valley. And Kathy will put a link in the chat where you can find out more about becoming a member. Oh, yep, she put it in there. So we are talking about the living soil of our land today, and I want to acknowledge that these soils and everything that relies on them have been an integral part of the lives of the Indigenous people on whose homelands I currently sit. The Wenatchee Piscosa, the Eniat, the Chelan, and the Moses Columbia, and others have been part of these lands for thousands of years. They have cared for them for just as long and continue to do so. It truly dwarfs the few decades that the Land Trust has been around. Thanks to them, we have healthy soils, and the knowledge of these lands that is preserved in Indigenous culture is precious. Here at the Land Trust, we're working to respectfully learn from and support local tribes as they carry out their work to care for their homelands. If you haven't already, I encourage you to find out more about the history and future goals of the Indigenous people of our area. Okay, so now I would like to introduce our speaker this evening, Lydia Bailey. Lydia is currently pursuing a PhD with Dr. Matt Bowker and Dr. Anita Antoninka at Northern Arizona University. Born in Alabama, she moved west to get her bachelor's degree in environmental science and biology from Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. She found a new home in arid landscapes and has spent the last 10 years living and working across the Western United States. Beginning as a botanist, she worked for the Nature Conservancy, National Park Service, and Bureau of Land Management before beginning graduate school in Flagstaff. Her dissertation focuses on the use of soil organisms to improve restoration outcomes on highly disturbed areas of the Mojave Desert in collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management. Welcome, Lydia, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. So good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited that I get to participate all the way from Arizona.
Yeah, I'm excited about the Q&A as well, and really excited to share the presentation that I got to see a couple of weeks ago. So let me get that up there and we can get started. Hold on just a second.
Thanks so much for having me tonight. My name is Lydia Bailey. I'm a PhD student at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I'm going to talk to you about my research on restoration using biological soil crusts. First, a bit of background about me. I got my bachelor's degree at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, where I spent a lot of time hiking in the mountains and holding my friends up as I tried to identify the smallest plants I could find. Over the last several years, I've been working for Bureau of Land Management, doing rangeland monitoring, and getting more and more excited about smaller and smaller organisms, which has brought me to my current PhD position, working with biological soil crusts, which you see on the right-hand side here. What I'm going to talk about today is background biology on what crusts are and what they do, how we use them as a restoration tool, and lastly, a quick highlight of some of the work I'm doing in sagebrush ecosystems. What is Biocrust? It's actually a really complex community made up of many members, with the most important ones being bacteria, lichens, and bryophytes. And these live together in varying proportions in the soil surface in deserts all over the world. They have a lot of different names. You might also know them as cryptogamic, cryptobiotic, or microbiotic soils, but we're currently rebranding them to just be called biocrusts. When I say bacteria, I'm talking specifically about cyanobacteria, which you might also know as blue-green algae, but are not an algae because we don't like to make anything too easy. But these are the inventors of photosynthesis, the first organisms to develop that ability. And they're really powerful, cool organisms. One of my favorite things about cyanobacteria are they actually form colonies that are so large, you can see them with your bare eyes. This is a handful of nostoc colonies, which I would love to poke. They look very, very fun to play with. We also work with lichens. When I say lichen, you might imagine this kind of leafy green growth on rocks or gravestones. But I don't know anything about that lichen because the ones I work with are a completely different set of species that live only on the soil surface. Lichens themselves are quite complicated. They're made up of multiple organisms, a fungi partnered with something that photosynthesizes growing together, and they grow really slowly, and they're one of my favorite parts of the biocrust. Lastly, I mentioned bryophytes, and by that I specifically mean mosses and to a lesser extent liverworts. These are both non-vascular plants. They're some of the fastest growing and most visible members of the biocrust community. If you've seen a picture of biocrust one place in the world, probably looks something like this. This is the Canyonlands National Park near Moab, Utah, and you see this dark, bumpy mass on the foreground, and that's all biocrusts. They're actually really diverse, and they look different all over the world. In the Mojave, you have these really light, almost invisible cyanobacteria-dominated crusts. In the Sonoran, we actually find these liverwort crusts. Out in the Great Basin, you're likely to see a lot more of these mosses. We even have crusts that grow post-burn in forests and mountains all over the western US. And there's crusts ranging from the Atacama deserts of Peru to the Icelandic highlands. Crust can look really different depending on who makes it up and the specific climate of where it's growing, but there's some things that are true of all crusts. First is their incredible desiccation tolerance. A biocrust can dry out completely without dying, which is amazing because they can inhabit extremely harsh environments by just spending most of their time inactive, which is a great adaptation, but it also has a cost in that they spend most of their life not growing. So they are only active right after rains when there's enough moisture in the soil. This is a live time, real-time video of a Centrichia stem being rehydrated. You might hear some smooth jazz stylings in the background. That's what our techs like to listen to. And here it's going from completely desiccated to photosynthetically active right before your eyes in a matter of 30 seconds. This is really a physiological marvel that we're studying. There's a whole field just trying to understand how an organism is able to do such an extreme rehydration. All of these organisms are also totipotent. This means that any small part of them can be broken off and then grow into a whole new organism. So biocrusts do occasionally spread sexually using spores, but really asexual reproduction by being broken and fragmented and then being blown across the landscape is the main way that they spread and reproduce. Those are a lot of the really cool strengths of biocrusts, but they have some weaknesses. As I mentioned, they're slow growing because they spend so much time dormant. The crust might really only be active for a couple weeks out of the year. They're also quite fragile to crushing disturbances. So things like large-scale soil development, off-highway travel, those kinds of large-scale activities can remove crust from the landscape pretty easily. So that's what crusts are, and here's what they do. Some of these are relatively complicated, but I'll give you just the basic takeaway message from each of these main functions. First is their incredible ability to stabilize soils. All of the members work together to do this. We've got lichens and mosses, these little root-like structures which help anchor the soil. And they also protect the surface of the soil with their physical bodies, which prevents water and wind from accessing loose soil particles and moving them from a site. But really, the MVP of soil stabilization, in my opinion, is the cyanobacteria. You can see here in the center photo, there are strands of cyanobacteria winding around mineral particles of soil, holding them together. What you can't see is that they're also exuding a bunch of like a snot-like glue called EPS, extrapolysaccharides, which binds all the soils together. So this top right photo, you see these strings dangling down from a little segment of crust, and those are actually cyanobacteria colonies that you can see that are so strong they can hold those big clumps of soil together. So this is also really important for human health. You might have heard about here in the Southwest, we have these big dust storms called haboobs, which not only impact human health just because there's so much particulate in the air, but in that particulate are fragments of the valley fever fungus, which is a fungus that causes a lung infection. And our lab is actually starting to work on a project to see if we can use biocrust to help stabilize soils in urban areas to minimize these effects on the communities who live in the Southwest. Another thing they do is influence hydrology in a couple different ways. One is that you can see the sort of rough, mumpy surface. It means that water has to wind back and forth between these mounds and it flows it down, so it's not just washing off site and causing erosion. By slowing it down, it has a chance to infiltrate. The organisms themselves are also absorbing water. Moss can hold, I think it's like 1,000 times its weight in water, some of the mosses we work with. And the crust also is acting kind of like a blanket, holding the water into the soil at surface. They also have a couple different ways of influencing soil fertility, both active and passive. Passive, we're talking about dust capture. Dust is a whole scientific field called aeolian studies, and it's a lot more interesting than I ever thought I would find it. But dust is full of a lot of nutrients and important resources. So as it's blowing across the landscape, the crust can help capture the dust and it builds up that material on the soil surface of nutrient-rich particles. They also do some active fixation through photosynthesis. Of course, they're fixing carbon. Some of these members are also nitrogen fixing, which is especially important because nitrogen is often one of the most limiting nutrients in these arid ecosystems. It's said that when active, the crust on the soil surface is continuous to essentially an enormous leaf covering the ground in terms of its photosynthetic activity. Okay, and now I put this slide up to talk about vascular plant relationships, and we're not going to talk about this graph. I just put it up there to scare you because they are frighteningly complicated, but we're starting to chip away at this area and get a better understanding. Some of the basic things we found are biocrusts, is they create this rough surface. They create spots that can capture seeds, organic matter, and water, and they bring them together creating perfect little pockets for plants to germinate and establish. On the other hand, if you've got a really thick crust, like this lichenous crust you see here, that could actually prevent plants from establishing because the rootlets can't penetrate them. This can be good news if you're reducing exotics. The seed you see here is actually cheatgrass. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with cheatgrass, but it's one of the worst native plants in the West and causes a lot of devastation by changing fire regimes. It's also really annoying in your socks. There's nothing good to say about it. So this can be a great benefit of the crusts, but if it's preventing native plants from establishing, that could be a problem. Once the plants have established, crusts generally can increase the soil temperature, the nutrient availability, and the water, which can result in really robust, much larger plants. So here you see the same species grown in a greenhouse in units with and without crust. And with crust, it's triple, quadruple the size of without, which is great if it's a plant you want. What we're looking at here is actually a cheatgrass. So again, not desirable. But there has been some promising research that's found that higher sites with higher biocrust cover are more resistant to cheatgrass invasion. So it is potentially a really important tool in keeping our rangelands healthy. So what we do in my lab is look at ways to use all these functions, the ability to stabilize soil, influence hydrology, fix nutrients, and influence plants, and deploy these functions in restoration projects. My lab works all over the Western US, from northern Washington to the border of Mexico. And this is just my lab. There's much of other labs doing concurrent work all over the country. And what we're doing right now is developing the techniques. So this is 3 stages in our process. First is figuring out how to acquire biocrust, either by salvaging or growing it, then how to put it in the field, and how to make sure it stays there and is happy. This is a relatively new field. This figure on the right is the number of papers about biocrust restoration published per year. So you can see there's really been a huge, huge boom in the last couple of years. All the dark bar that you see there is from a single issue of restoration ecology. So we're trying to really rapidly advance our knowledge in this area. And it's an exciting time to be in biocrust research because there's so many questions to try answering all at once. So some of the methods that we've been using consistently are salvage. When you have an area that's already planned for disturbance, you can go out beforehand and use hand trowels or snow shovels. And in one case, we even used a back-end loader. We're trying to work on scaling up. So we use this heavy machine on a mine in Las Vegas. And we're targeting areas that would otherwise be destroyed by things like road expansion, mine pit expansion, trailhead building, in order to acquire material to use in other sites or in restoring that same site once work is done. We've also looked at ways of growing crust, and we've developed some really consistent ways to grow it within a matter of months, either in solution in the lab or in these greenhouse arrays in Flagstaff. But some of the problems with indoor cultivation is that the crusts have a pretty cushy life in this system. They have all the water and nutrients they need. They're protected from some UV rays. And so we found that taking these crusts out into the field, sometimes they cannot do as well as we'd hope, and they don't survive super well. It's like taking a tomato plant straight from inside your house, putting it in the garden in full sun without hardening it off first. And so we haven't found a way of effectively hardening them, and instead we're looking at ways to grow them outdoors, because this way we're still able to increase their growth rate. We're giving them nutrients, water, and a little bit of shade, but they have a lot more fluctuation in hot, cold, and wet, dry, and UV intensity than we can provide them in a greenhouse. We've got a couple different trials running all over the country. We call this the quesadilla method. Our lab is always hungry, and we have a lot of food-based ideas in how to do our science. And so in the case of growing crust, the layers of our quesadilla are a sheet of burlap, some soil, maybe a loosely woven jute mesh to help hold that soil in place, a sprinkling of crust, and then shade cloth on top. And so I've got some trials running right now, and it seems pretty promising. We can potentially be able to double our crust volume in a couple months. We've scaled it up even further. This is a really cool project I won't go into any more detail on. There's a researcher based out of Moab, Utah, named Colin Tucker, who has done some amazing work to create this massive biocrust farm up in Utah. So once you've got the crust, we got to put it on the field. We crumble it up pretty much for all these methods, and that crumbled up biocrust is called inoculum. We've looked at different ways of putting it on the ground, including mechanized rangeland drills and other farming equipment, pelletizing it so it could potentially be dropped from an airplane like they do in a lot of post-fire restoration. We've got one student right now, one PhD student working on developing ways of making crust pasta, again with the food. but potentially spaghetti strips or ravioli pouches with seeds inside of them, something like that, so we can have an easy way of carrying this product and spreading it across the landscape. But most of our work has been done spreading it by hand with buckets and rakes. One other cool thing that we've tried is growing this moss cloth. Some of the mosses can grow directly off the burlap with no soil at all. So we built a fog chamber and have these sheets of burlap completely covered in moss. And they've been taken out to a ranch in Montana and placed above planted seedlings to help protect them from erosion, or around seedlings to act as like a living weed cloth. So these are really pretty promising. We're excited to get results back from these in the next couple of years. So once the crust is out in the landscape, we're looking at ways to encourage establishment. This is important because freshly applied crust is really vulnerable to be lost to things like wind, water, or insects until they fuse down with the soil. We've had issues like in post-burn areas. If you spread a bunch of moss stems all over the ground, one project, one of my lab mates found all of his moss being carried into ant mounds throughout the forest because there's so few other sources of nutrients in these harsh environments sometimes. So some of the things that we're working on to encourage establishment is using a small-scale land imprinter, which is the leftmost thing that you see here, the big spiky barrel. This is a tool that I built. It's a 200 or 300 pound barrel covered in pyramid-shaped spikes that you drag across the desert, which is really fun unless you start going downhill, in which case it starts being somewhat alarming. But the idea here is to press the biocrust into the soil surface, as well as to create this waffle-like texture where you have little pockets for water and seed to accumulate. And you've got different aspects and shading going on. So this is something that I've been trying out. I deployed it for the first time about a year and a half ago, so I'm hoping to get results back from that soon. We also have used psyllium husk. This is essentially a commercial grade Metamucil, and it does on the ground what it does in your body. It makes a lot of goo when it's wet, which is great in soil science because it helps bind everything together in a way that doesn't interfere with the crust's own ability to grow into the soil. And it also provides a little bit more nutrient because it's a plant-based product and it won't persist, it'll degrade over time. Just watering alone is actually also quite a powerful way of attaching soil crusts to the soil surface. We've also worked with these straw borders that create tiny fences essentially on the soil surface, a couple inches high, that can stop wind and water and prevent these loose sandy soils from being moved off site. So then I'll give a quick highlight of the work I'm doing out in Washington. I'm working with the Bureau of Land Management out of Wenatchee, northeast of Wenatchee in this old pasture. The goal we have here is to establish middle to late successional biocrust community in Restoration Islands. Restoration Islands is this really cool concept of a way to restore where instead of spreading all of your effort evenly across a large area, you have small areas where you put a lot of time and effort into them and your resources. And you create a complex and robust, healthy community of all of the different members you're excited about. And over time, those islands will hopefully merge and create a whole landscape of complexity. So what we're starting with, you see on the left-hand side here is a old field of pasture grasses that have been mowed down to create these islands. And what we want to have is this complex sagebrush community with many different plant species, as well as a lot of biocrust cover. We've got a couple of different questions for addressing in Wenatchee. First is, how well can we grow those crusts? Second is, how well do those crusts do when we put them out in the field? And can we boost their survival rate using something called abscisic acid? And lastly, what application rate is most efficient? To answer this first question, I'm working on doing 2 rounds of quesadillas up in Washington. One I did in the parking lot at the BLM office in Wenatchee, because we're always looking for the most scenic sites for our field photos. And this quesadilla ran from 2018 to 2019, and there was no consistent water input. We just ran it off of the winter precipitation, and we had a pretty surprising growth from that. But we are also right now doing a second run of quesadillas on a seed farm in Moses Lake, BFI seed farm, where we are manipulating not only adding water every week, but also adding fertilizer to half of the treatments every couple months. And so this inset photo on the right-hand side, you can see a kind of greenish cast to the soil surface. And that's actually all biocrust growth. These are biocrust organisms. And that's just 2 months after installing this in October of last year. So I'll be going out in Washington in June, and I can't wait to see how well these crusts have grown. So from that first crust, we took some of those crusts that we grew and we took them out into the field. And we had 10 replicates of this experiment. Each had 4 plots. And the plots received either no additional crust salvaged directly from the field, crust that we had salvaged and grown out, and lastly, some of that salvaged grown out crust that we added abscisic acid to. And abscisic acid works kind of like a moss Gatorade. It's full of electrolytes and it makes the rehydration process less traumatic and helps boost its survival, hopefully, once out in the field. So we installed this in October of 2019, and we'll get file results from that this summer. The last thing we did was do this application rate experiment. Our question here is, what percent cover of the soil surface as a treatment do we get the best growth from? Because we don't want to add any more than is necessary, since that means we'd be able to restore a smaller area with a given volume of material. So we're testing between 0 and 40% cover. We've got 2 replicate blocks of this out in the Douglas pasture. And again, we'll get results back from this later this summer. So if you were out in the West and you see a bunch of people looking something like this, there's a good chance you're looking at crusties. We're known for having to find pretty strange postures because we're always trying to put our face on the ground without touching anything else. So if you see some people out in the desert with their heads on the ground and their butts in the air, you should come say hi. This chance it's us. I also just wanted to plug you this free Biocrust field guide, which is a guide to identifying the species of the Western US Biocrusts. And we also have a restoration handbook. So if you want to know more, but not only the methods I've shown you, but a lot of other things, because a lot of different researchers trying a bunch of different methods for restoration, making restoration easier and more effective. We've got this one document that compiles everything we know as of this year. So I want to thank you all for listening, and also to thank the Wenatchee and Las Vegas Bureau of Land Management offices for supporting my research. I want to also thank my advisors, Dr. Matt Bowker and Anita Antoninka, and all the other members of my lab who have helped in the field and provided photos for this presentation. I'll also put my website link on this slide.
Hey, thank you so much, Lydia, for that wonderful presentation. We have a bunch of questions. Oh yeah, and Kathy's going to put some of those links that she mentioned at the end of her presentation in the chat, and then you're also going to get that in an email tomorrow. So in case you want to check out that, I really like the field guide to Biocrust is really cool. So we have a bunch of questions, and I will start with this one, if you don't mind, Lydia. Let's see. Is there a sense of our changes in it? So is there a sense that
Sure.
that the changes in climate are likely to affect biocrust communities in the Columbia River Basin and in Washington?
I don't know if I can speak directly to the Columbia River Basin area on the Colorado Plateau in Utah, where there is this, I think it's almost 50 built shelters that divert an amount of rain, heat lamps to change both the precipitation and the temperature patterns that the crusts are undergoing. And what we see is a real loss of mosses and an increase in cyanobacteria cover. So I would expect that in the Columbia Basin, where you have more of a moss-dominated crust, that might be even more pronounced. And with shifting weather patterns as well, if you have like a crust energy to come out of dormancy, and so if you have really small events happening in the summer instead of larger rain events in the winter, it can exhaust their energy coming out of dormancy and require that energy. So there's a concern that shifting from winter snow to small summer rain events will cause the crust to sort of wake themselves up so much that they'll actually die. So that's a bummer.
Yeah.
But
Cool. That is a bummer. Are you, so maybe it might be my internet connection, but I'm having, like, you seem to be coming in and out, and I'm wondering if other people are getting that as well.
Okay,
I am. People are saying that as well.
Okay, I can try switching. I got a bunch of snow this week, and my internet has been slow since then.
Okay, but what
Okay.
I heard basically was that we don't know about Washington so much, but in Colorado they're doing research. They're doing experiments to see how adding heat and other climatic changes will affect the biocrust, and that the ones that have more moss in them might be more affected, which is what we have up here, right?
Yep. And uh, part that might have also gotten cut off is this concern about changing timing of the rain,
Right.
because in the West we're having smaller rain events in the summer that can tire the crusts out because they don't stay wet long enough to regain any energy after they come out of dormancy, and that can deplete their resources and cause mortality.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we can hear you well now, and I'm glad that
Great.
you re-explained that. Okay, so you mentioned that biocrusts are damaged by trampling, and if we're out hiking and there's no trail and we have to walk on the crust, is it better to walk single file or to spread out to protect it?
I think that it's actually better to walk spread out and try to, when we're traveling across crusty landscape, I try to follow water flow patterns or rock hop or step underneath plants. And the concern isn't really a single incidence of people walking across it, but if you leave footprints, people are likely to follow behind you because they think that you're going somewhere they want to go, even if you're just like stepping off the trail to use the restroom or something. And so we are especially careful about it when you're within sight of a trail to not make a clear path for other people to follow.
Okay, cool. Where is a good place to see really healthy biocrusts around here?
Yeah, I've seen some really great biocrusts in the Wenatchee area up in the highlands on the wetter side of drainages, especially. There's really diverse and robust crust community on the north facing sides of drainages, including some big mosses that I don't see really very many other places except for like in high mountains. So it's a cool community.
Cool. Awesome.
And if you're walking out there, if you're not sure, pouring a bunch of water on the ground too is a great way of seeing if what you've got there is crust, because a lot of it you'll see an immediate green up. But just make sure you add enough that it's thoroughly wet, because as I said, those little wetting events can actually cause harm to them.
Huh, cool. Awesome. Or maybe it's a better thing to do like in the winter.
Yeah, in the winter, in the evenings when they're not going to get dried out as quickly. I certainly pour a lot of my water out just because I always want to see what's where. But
Cool. Things that like if you're not researching this, like there's no way for me to even know that that's like something cool that you can do.
yeah, it's our main party trick. It's just pouring water on moss for people and be like, look at this.
Awesome.
We love our science.
Okay, next question is, are there research projects to understand the impact of fire on biocrusts and or reestablishment after fire?
There's actually a whole section of Biocrust research about fire mosses, and there's a couple genuses of mosses that are common all across the Western US, and after fire, they'll establish themselves really quickly, and in some ecosystems create up to like an over 80% cover of mosses in a freshly burned area that was previously forest or still has trees, but under tree canopy. And it has an important ecological function for protecting those recently bared soils from soil erosion. And so people in my lab are working on ways of using that as a restoration tool, creating pellets of mosses or spreading mosses post-burn in areas where the mosses aren't regenerating to try to create that surface cover.
Cool. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Someone asks, are biocrusts only in dry areas? Can we see them in wetter places as well?
Our conventional definition has been that they're in arid landscapes. There's sometimes people use other terms for a similar phenomena like biofilm, which you might have heard for in really, really wet environments. But there are recent conversations about kind of expanding that definition, because researchers have found what looks and seems to function just like crust in the jungles of Peru, and we've seen them in really high elevation, kind of wetter places in Scandinavia. And so generally we talk about them in arid landscapes, and I think they probably have the most ecological function there because they're feeling it. There's so much otherwise bare ground in arid landscapes, whereas plants in other places that tend to be so dense. But there definitely is biocrust-like formations elsewhere as well.
Cool. How about, do you ever see a day where people could maybe buy biocrust pellets and like use it on their own land?
We have something of a dream about that. There is, an industry, or that's repetitive, but there's an industry for mycorrhizal fungi inoculum that people are producing and selling. But studies have found that most of that is not actually live material and isn't really doing what people are saying it does.
Huh.
But we have dreams of trying to manufacture ways of growing enough crust to be able to sell it and market it. And talking to my advisor, he's had random thoughts like, what if we combine the business of scraping moss off people's roofs in Seattle and then sold it to other people to put elsewhere? But there may be some adaptive differences between us, because the same species occur on roofs in Seattle as in some of the same species overlap, but they might have pretty distinct morphologies or plasticities that change how they work.
I would assume so.
Presumably, but who knows? Maybe enough would survive that that's a way we could harvest mosses that already grow for free.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. Some asked, how long can a lichen or biocrust live?
In dormancy, we have had cases of biocrust organisms, including lichens, that were stored for over 80 years in a dry, cool environment, and were able to regenerate after that, come out of dormancy. So their ability to survive dry is incredible. We don't know the outer limits of their lifespan.
That makes who was storing biocrust years ago?
There are lichen and moss samples in a lot of herbariums, and so people have gone out and found little samples. Normally they'll be in tiny envelopes or boxes in the back of the cupboard in some of the older herbariums, and people have taken single leaves of moss and gotten them to grow.
Wow, that's cool. So here's the next question. Can a healthy biocrust surface live in an area that's being grazed by livestock?
That's a very controversial question within the field. I don't know that we can firmly answer that. A lot of people would probably say no, but I'd say that it depends on what you mean by healthy and in the characteristics of the grazing, because a certain amount of disturbance is normal in any environment. We have herds of roaming ungulates already out in the field who are also trampling it. But intensive grazing over a long period of time does tend to lead to a decrease in crusts. Different organisms are also more resilient to that trampling. Cyanobacteria, for instance, can move up and down on the soil surface by essentially excreting goo and kind of pushing themselves via goo. And so a lot of the trouble with trampling is that these organisms will be overturned or pulverized, but the cyanobacteria, since they can move up or down, if they're overturned, they can still find the soil surface and survive.
Cool. Can you grow crust? So I think mentioning that you were scraping it off of people's roofs. The other way around, can you grow crust on the roof of your house?
That would be a great use of space. Yeah, potentially. So far, we mainly do it in the greenhouse or in greenhouse arrays, but that's also partially because we live in Arizona, where the climate is extremely harsh, since we go from, in Flagstaff, having 100 inches of snow to hot, dry summer to monsoon. So it's pretty hard to grow things here no matter what outside. But I think that we probably could. Living groups are great. Mosses grow really quickly. We're working on the technology to grow lichens faster.
Cool. What is the greatest threat to biocrusts today?
That's a good question. I do think that it is probably climate change, like it is for most things, just because it's one that we have no way of counteracting in a local area. It takes a lot, an effort that I don't know how to do to stop it, since I'm not looking to go into Congress or trying to be a political advocate as much. Yeah, of course, that is a part of my work, but it's not my main focus. But other than that, some of the other issues that they face are, in the places I work in the Mojave, just the renewable energy expansion is actually impacting a lot of biocrust rich areas, and the way that solar farms are currently installed requires completely scraping the soil surface. and undoing all of those relationships between the soil and the crust and the plants. And we haven't really figured out a way to bring those back. And that's something that we're hoping to figure out how to do, because the solar farms, especially in Southern California and Southern Nevada, are spreading over huge acres and acres at a time, with no real way of bringing back that stability. And they create dust sources because they have no stability that also have pretty serious downwind effects on the environment downwind of them.
Yeah, it's a hard puzzle to figure out.
Yeah, you don't want your renewable energy to have environmental degradation. But there's some interesting conversations about whether or not we can put up a solar facility without doing that, because once it's up, most of them nowadays require very little maintenance and very little travel within the field. And so instead of clearing the ground, can we use like taller pylons to raise them above the soil surface so that you can still have an intact desert underneath them?
Cool. Yeah. We have just a couple more questions, actually. Are there any kinds of biocrusts that are endangered?
Yes, there are endangered crusts, and there's also endemic species within the crust. I work in one area called Gold Butte, Nevada, which is near Mesquite, Nevada. It's right on the Arizona-Nevada border, north of Lake Mead, and they have an endemic moss that lives only on gypsum-rich soils in Gold Butte. And so some of those species are definitely endangered, and there's also a ton of diversity that we don't even know about, and that we don't know what kind of diversity in the columbolans and the nematodes and all of the other like tiny soil organisms. We are barely even understand lichen biology. So there's could be unknown numbers of species that are under threat. I think probably gypsum crusts in general are more under threat because we have very small areas of gypsum soil in the US. They're often pretty far apart, and they have really unique crust communities, but gypsum is also a highly desirable mineral. So almost all of those areas have mining threats.
Yeah, interesting. And then if anybody else has questions, pop them in the chat. But I think this might be our last question, which is, are some of these organisms helpful in weed suppression aside from just being a physical barrier? Like, do they have other properties?
That is a great question. I think that in a roundabout way they do. We're still learning a lot more about the direct relationships between the crusts and the crust organisms and vascular plants. But the way that the rhizosphere, which is the whole community of things that live in the root zone of a plant, changes in response to that plant, and the plant changes in response to the rhizosphere, it means that invasive plants can change the soil so that native plants can't really come back in. There's great research about this with cheatgrass and sagebrush, where the cheatgrass changed the bacterial community so much that it makes it really challenging for sagebrush to reestablish. And so we are working at looking at ways of bringing in the healthy soil so that we can help the plants. And potentially that relationship goes the other way if we can maintain the right soil bacteria and soil biocrust community. It could physically and also, allopathically or chemically prohibit some weeds from establishing.
Yeah, Margie says like probiotics for your gut.
Yeah, exactly.
Kathy distracts me and asks questions that are funny puns, but she said, if you had to liken Biocrust to a part of the body, which would it be?
Some people like to say that Biocrust is the living skin of the desert, but I don't like to say that because it sounds gross and people don't respond well to that.
Nice. Maybe it's more like the gut. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I just love hearing all of it. I feel like I'm gonna come up with like 8 more questions as soon as we get off here that I just like have to know. But thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And my contact info is up on my website. If people have any more questions, I'm always happy to talk to people about crust.
Yeah, wonderful. Cool. Maybe I'll send you weird pictures of soil.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay. I love seeing weird pictures of, well, when I look through my phone, it keeps being like, is this a cookie? And I'm like, nope, it's just dirt. Dirt.
That's great. And everybody's saying thank you in the chat. So yeah. So I can stick around and people, if it seems like a lot of people are watching, just listening. So I think that we're probably just gonna to call it a night and just thank everybody for coming and have a good evening, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.